Good evening, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, November the 4th. It's 6 p.m., and I'd like to get started by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. For starters, I'll look for a motion to approve the agenda, please. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to propose an amendment, and that is item 4 is under Administration of Finances, our consideration of the staff report on the use of amenity contributions. That'll be, I'm sure, a fulsome discussion amongst committee members, but we do have 2 presentations this evening, and I propose moving that discussion on amenity contributions after the 2 presentations.
Second.
Thank you. So I'll look for approval of the agenda as amended.
So move.
All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. Motion's carried. That makes the first item, the next item is presentations. Those fall under item 7 on the agenda. The first, therefore, and we've got nothing under Parks and Infrastructure, nothing under Protective Services. So that brings us to agenda item number 7. The first is 7A, which is a development permit application for 2315 Mills Road. And we have a presentation from Christine Lintott. I am going to remove myself from this discussion under potential conflict of interest in that my wife works for Amica, and I will turn the chair over to Councillor O'Keefe, who is next in the rotation as acting mayor in December.
Right then, yeah, go ahead, please proceed.
All right, good evening, Mayor and Council. Thanks so much for having us here this evening. My name is Christine Lintott. I'm a local architect, and I'm here on behalf of my clients, Amica Senior Lifestyles. Amica is the owner of the property at 2315 Mills Road. Just get the slide up here. And the existing property is currently home to 79 individual independent living suites. And the proposal in front of you is for an addition to this specific neighborhood for the purposes of creating a continuum of care. Amica is moving to a model of residential living where they see that there's a tremendous need to have people basically age in place. And so adding assisted living and memory care neighborhoods is a vital part of the evolution of this specific community. So in evaluating the site, and this is zooming in, we've actually been working on the project for approximately 2 years now, and we've done a number of assessments on the existing property. Along the top is Mills Road, and then along the bottom, the site continues right through to Henry Street, where we're proposing, after extensive studies, to add the additional neighborhoods is on what is essentially the Henry Street frontage, which is an existing surface parking lot. The proposed addition will add 69 additional suites. 20 of those suites are on the first floor, and they will be designated for memory care. And it's a specific memory care neighborhood, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then 2 floors of assisted living above, again for a total of 69 suites. The existing, as per your staff report, the existing or the proposed development is consistent with the zoning, RMC, care-oriented residential, again consistent with the 3-story height. The existing building footprint is approximately 2,600 square meters, slightly less, 2,572. And the proposed additional footprint is approximately 1,525 square meters. We are proposing to put 72 parking stalls, 40 of which are in a new underground below the proposed addition. with 24 existing surface in the front parking lot along Mills Road. I just want to share this with you. This is the memory care neighborhood on the ground floor, and it gives you a little sense of some of the work we've done with our landscape architect, Ladder, to develop a meaningful outdoor interface along the perimeter to the adjacent properties. You'll see an image in a moment on the frontage improvements that we're proposing. On the lower left corner of the site plan, you can see the access to the underground parking, which is proposed. And then at the top left, you can see the outdoor connected secure area for the memory care residents. This is the proposed south addition at Henry Street. We spent quite a bit of time developing a massing and a language that is residential in feel and respects the adjacent massing and character along Henry Street, or along Henry Avenue, apologize. And that's it. Any questions?
All right, members of council, questions? Councillor Garnett?
Thank you for the presentation. I personally think it's a great idea. Aging in place is extremely important. Having independent living, assisted living, right through to memory care. And you talked about the lockdown portion of it. I totally understand that, having a father-in-law that went through that. I guess the only thing I'm wondering about is having only one accessible parking space. I'm wondering if obviously you guys have done your research, but I'm wondering if maybe more might be something that might make it a little more tenable to people.
Yeah, it's a great question. Vast majority of the residents who live, even in the independent living portion, simply don't drive. Okay. The ratios that we're seeing and often providing for in these particular residences is about 0.3 to 1 in terms of actual car use. And even then, often those vehicles are never moved. They do get parked when residents initially move in. One of the things about the Amica model is that they do have an exclusive service for busing and transporting people around. They have a designated van that they use. So there's huge accessibility and mobility offered to the residents, where the need isn't as great. The vast majority of the underground parking is getting used for staff. And then, of course, we are meeting the parking ratios required by the municipality.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question as far as staff, and I'm assuming that guests can park there, because I'm assuming they have
do,
regular
and
visitors.
That's exactly, and that's part of the use as well, is just having guests and visitors that are.
That's kind of where I was thinking about the accessible part, because they're probably going to have a fair amount of elderly people visit them that might have mobility issues, and I'm wondering if there might be more advisable to have just even one or two more spots for those people that come to visit them, maybe?
Yeah, it's a fair comment. We could certainly look at that. We're not, again, we have a number of them that we're doing with Amica on the lower island here. Most recently, Amica at Gorge is one of our properties. And we're not seeing the demand that you would expect. I think it's sort of anecdotally, it feels like that would be correct, but we really have been tinkering with those ratios as each new property folds out, and that's really what we're seeing in terms of demand. But we will have a look at it. If we can get a couple more accessible stalls, we certainly will look at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Councillor Follett?
Thank you. Just a practical question regarding your kitchen facilities. If you're expanding and quite significantly, is there going to have to be an expansion to what you've got currently in your kitchen? There
isn't actually, and it is a great question. The way the model works is that in the memory care neighborhood, there's actually a servery. Let's see if I can go back to it. I don't want to get too much into detail. There is a small kitchen servery area in the memory care neighborhood, but the bulk of the food is actually prepared in the main kitchen, and there is adequate sizing and capacity in the existing kitchen for that. In fact, how many years ago did they do a renovation of their whole kitchen and dining area? So their capacity is there to allow for both the memory care and the assisted living. And then for the assisted living neighborhoods, and again, these, I probably didn't explain it very well, but This addition actually extends to the existing building, so it's linked by corridors. So on the second and third floor, the assisted living residents have access to the main dining room, although there are also dining rooms on each of those floors for folks that maybe don't have a level of mobility to be able to join in that common area. So I guess what I'm trying to convey is there's flexibility in terms of how the food is managed, so it's operationalized to some extent. And a lot of the decisions that we've made around the size of these particular neighborhoods stems from what the existing infrastructure can support. So that kind of internal analysis has been done. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Councillor Duncan?
Hi, yeah, thank you. As with Councillor Garnett, I had questions about the parking, but your answer about the staff. So they're assigned spots, so I'm guessing the ones that are empty, staff know that they can park in ahead of time, and you're not, you know, they know, yeah.
It can be operationalized.
That it is operationalized, okay, and visitor parking, I'm guessing as well, you kind of can know this block down here, when you have visitors, we've got 8 spots, you can go there.
Yeah, and it is secured, and there is a system that allows for people to be buzzed in. So that's all managed through the systems that we install in the building.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. And I guess the other question I had, just anecdotally seeing what ends up happening in these places is we have more people moving into mobility scooters.
Yep.
And so I said, you know, like we need like designated scooter parking in these underground parking garages. And I don't know, how have you been managing that? Because what I've seen is just people kind of with extension cords running all the way through and, you know, crammed on the sides. So is there something you've been able to start to tinker with and put in place for people to have a safe place to park them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Building inspectors hate that arrangement, and in new projects we are having to put actual rated enclosures because they can be a fire hazard with the various charging mechanisms. So we actually have to create a rated room, and that is in the underground. And we have, I didn't bring the underground level with me today, but it is in your package, and you can see that there's designated spaces. And that demand is getting bigger and bigger. I think we're just early days on another project, and I think what we're going to see is really pushing those parking ratios again, because we're not seeing the demand, and really asking for other municipal folks to think about how we can enhance those mobility scooter zones over the parking. And especially as you are quite a compact, walkable community, and this is in proximity, so that ability for folks to have that independence and they're not comfortable behind a wheel, it just makes sense. Mm-hmm. But we have made that provision, and I apologize, I just don't have it in my presentation.
Oh, no, thank you. That's great. I guess we just have to think about what infrastructure we now need for them when they come shooting out of the parking lot and and Henry. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I had a follow-up question with regards to scooters, and I noticed that there seems to be ample bicycle parking as well, and I'm just wondering, given your residents, how much the bicycle parking is used, and is there has there been consideration to additional scooter parking, you know, versus bicycle parking?
It's a great question, and this is the tension we're in. We're in, you know, we have to meet regulations and bylaws, obviously, to demonstrate that. The bicycle parking, frankly, is being used by, the vast majority is by staff rather than by residents necessarily. There's certainly residents in the independent living side that we would see making use. And as electric scooters get more and more prominently used, we're actually providing charging stations. In this instance, we have provided the required parking for this particular neighborhood, and we anticipate that again, it'll be used by staff.
And a question about scooters in general. I mean, in your existing residence, if a resident you know, has serious mobility issues and really can't spend very much time outside of their scooter, are they allowed to take them to their residence? And
they take it on a case-by-case basis. It is very wearing on a facility. Often there's impacts on walls, and while we build a durable environment, it is a concern. But depending on the individual resident, that has been accommodated in some instances, or some sort of provision has been made. And they tend to be less robust scooters, so they're not kind of, there's some pretty ample scooters out there that, so I suspect that that's an operational issue with Amica.
Thank you.
I just have one question, just curious about how the current residents will be accommodated during the course of the renovation. So I noticed that there's 24 suites, I think, that will be demolished, and then some that will be renovated, and just curious how the current residents of those suites would be taken care of during that time.
Yeah, it's a great question. So they are not at 100% capacity. So there's definitely some moving around that will take place, and residents will be accommodated within the residence as best can be. And this, the beauty of this being an Amica property is there's other Amica properties also. So we haven't got, we're not at that place yet where we're thinking about where folks are going to be. We haven't applied for a building permit, for instance. So we're still a ways away. And that kind of evolution of the resident population is sort of constant. So they have options within the facility and also in other properties in close proximity on the Lower Island.
Oh, one more question, Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Actually, I'd like to, prepared to move the recommendation that development permit application number DP 100806 at 2315 Mills Road be forwarded to the Advisory Planning Commission for further review and comment.
Second. Any further discussion? Yes?
Yeah, I would just like to make the comment again, thank you for the presentation, and I think this is a win-win for Sydney. To have 45 additional units come to of seniors residents come to Sydney, I think is great, and bringing the continuum of care, expanding the service that will be provided to include assisted care and the memory care is tremendous as well for the community. So, also pleased to see that over the 2 years you've been working on this, no variances are required in terms of height, setbacks, density, parking. So, thank you very much.
All right. Any other discussion? No. All in favor then? Motion carries unanimously. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. And at this time, I'd like to call upon our next presenter and welcome Marina Josipovic to presentation on the Sydney Housing Needs Assessment. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for trying my last name.
Did I get it right?
Yeah, actually.
Okay.
Thanks. So, thank you, Mayor and Council, for having me this evening. My name is Marina Josipovic, and I'm here with Urban Matters to present on the housing needs assessment that we've been working on with town staff over the past few months. So I just want to acknowledge before we start that this project was partially funded by UBCM through the Housing Needs Report Program that recently came out this year. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so a quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to be doing a quick introduction of the study purpose and process that we undertook over the last few months, but the bulk of the presentation will be an overview of the findings from both the qualitative and the quantitative data that we looked at to understand housing needs. And I'll do an overview of the policy recommendations that we came through through the housing needs that we identified, and then any questions that you might have about our findings. So this study in Sydney takes place within the context of a provincial housing crisis. So there's a lot of trends that I'll be talking about that are specific to Sydney but are also happening more broadly. Rental vacancy rates across communities in BC have been at historic lows, and rental costs are outpacing incomes in many communities. So just a few examples: the Victoria Census Metropolitan Area, which includes Sydney, and the provincial rate, the vacancy rate is 1.1% and 1.4% respectively in 2018. So a healthy vacancy rate is generally considered to be between 3 to 5%. So you see how low that is. And then between 2008 and 2018, the cost of renting increased over 40%, just median rents in the two community areas that I'm looking at here. So that's far, far faster than incomes have grown. And as we know, home ownership is increasingly out of reach for most households. So in response to these trends across the province, in 2019, the government of BC introduced legislation requiring local governments to complete housing needs reports to understand what's going on and start to develop policies and actions in response to documented need. And so this report will in part fulfill that requirement. But it'll also serve some local purposes, more importantly. I know that the town wants to build an understanding of current and future housing needs across the housing continuum, which we have represented here graphically. So we looked at everything from supportive and transitional housing to rental housing to market ownership. And the study is intended to inform housing-related policy and the town's upcoming OCP review. So this represents just an overview of the process that we took over the summer. We spent time doing data collection on a variety of statistical data sources that I'll get to. We did interviews with key stakeholders in the community representing the housing continuum. We did analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, to understand what the data and interviews were telling us. And from that, we identified the key housing needs in Sydney and started to research best practices in other communities in BC to see, how were other communities responding to these issues. And from that, we developed some policy recommendations that came through in the final report that I believe you have. So some of the data sources that we looked at were Statistics Canada, so census from 2006, 2011, and 2016, CMHC housing market data, data from BC Housing, the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, BC Assessment, BC Statistics, Town of Sydney, building permit and other data, Victoria Real Estate Board, and AirDNA to look at short-term rentals. So to get right into the findings, I'll start with some demographic trends before getting into the housing trends that we're seeing. So in Sydney, the population has been growing slower than the region, the CRD overall, and that trend is kind of expected to continue if conditions stay the same. So between 2016 and 2024, and I'll explain the funny dates, 2016 is the last year that we have the census for. So the first thing that we did was estimate how the population was likely to have grown from 2016 to 2019. And then we projected for the next 5 years as required by the housing needs reports legislation. So over that period, it's anticipated that Sydney will grow by 597 households. Again, that looks like an exact figure, but it's just an estimate. And we're projecting that the breakdown between owner households and renter households will remain relatively the same. In terms of trends in the population, what we're also seeing is households are getting smaller. So in 2016, 80% of households in Sydney were 1 or 2 people, and 79% of households were either couples without children or individuals living alone. So just a graph to show that comparison. There is a typo in the one on the left, but couples without children and individuals not in census family is 79% in Sydney. But when we look at the size of homes in Sydney, almost half, or 44% or 43%, are 3 or more bedrooms. So we're also seeing that as population trends have evolved over time, there might also be a bit of a mismatch between the housing stock and the population in Sydney. When we looked at age, compared to Sydney, compared to the CRD, Sydney has a much higher proportion of adults over 65. So as you can see on the graph on the right, that darker green band at the top is adults 65 to 84. a much larger band than the CRD, and Sydney also has a smaller proportion of age groups under 55 in the region. And the table in the right bottom corner shows median age for Sydney. So in 2016, it was 58.2 compared to the CRD's 44.8. So it's an older community. But I just want to point to between 2006 and 2016, Sydney, the median age grew faster than the CRD, which means it was aging faster, even though it started at a higher rate. And so that trend is expected to continue both through the aging of the existing population, but also in migration of older households into Sydney. When we look at median household incomes, Sydney is a little bit below CRD, but over the 10-year period of the census, 2006 to 2016, median household incomes grew at a comparable rate, 10% to 11% in the CRD. What I do want to draw your attention to is median household incomes by tenure at the bottom here. So owner households generally make much higher incomes than renter households. This is common in most communities, but I just want to call your attention to it because it has implications for different affordability levels when we look at housing in the next few slides. So we, in addition to demographics, we looked at the trends in the home ownership market as well as in the rental market. So 76% of households in Sydney own. And over the 10-year period for which we have data, as you can see on the far right, average sales prices in Sydney have gone up dramatically. For single-family homes, 58%, for condos, 45%. But what's really interesting, and this is probably familiar to you, is most of that growth has actually been since 2015. Before that, prices were relatively stable. As part of this study, we did an affordability gap analysis to understand the relationship between incomes and the cost of owning or renting in Sydney. So this graph, I know it's a lot of information, but the key thing is the red and the green. So we looked at median household incomes for different household types. So couples without children, couples with children, lone parent families, and individuals not in census families, and compared it to what the monthly shelter costs would be for different types of homes and the average sales prices for those homes. So what this is showing is that for most households, ownership is out of reach, and significantly out of reach if we consider the affordability threshold of no more than 30% of your gross household income going to housing. Of course, you know, when we look at individuals not in census families, it's not that big of a concern that they can't afford a 3-bedroom single-family home, but it is a concern that they're priced out of a 1-bedroom apartment. And then with couples and children, where there is a bit more green, affordability is possible for smaller units, 1 or 2 bedrooms, but then it drops, the gap gets really wide for larger units, and those are monthly gaps. We also looked at rental market trends, so 24% of Sydney households rent, and as of 2018, there were 256 primary rental units in Sydney. So that number has changed little for the past decade, but I know that that's changing right now with new developments coming online this year and in the next few years. In addition to primary rental units, the secondary rental market is very large in Sydney, so over 1,000 households are estimated to be renting in the secondary rental market, so secondary suites, coach houses, rented condominiums, or whole homes. When we looked at primary rental market trends, again, similar to what we saw in home ownership, there's been a market change after 2015. And so since 2015, Sydney's rental vacancy rate has been at or near 0%, which is a very low rental vacancy rate. And as you can see on this graph, the primary rental market median rents have also risen faster than incomes, though not as dramatically as home ownership. The rise in median rents, I should also mention, have followed provincial caps. So what the Residential Tenancy Board would allow a landlord to increase their rent by each year for an existing tenant, but it hasn't kept up with, or incomes have not kept up with these increases. And then when we look at the gap analysis for rental market affordability, you can see it's not as dire as the home ownership or not as dramatic as the home ownership table. But individuals and lone parent families are going to be facing the greatest challenges in the rental market as it is today. And I should also say that all of this data is for the primary rental market, because secondary rental, CMHC doesn't collect data on the secondary rental market, so there are some data gaps. But in many communities, secondary rental can sometimes be pricier than primary rental, especially if it's a whole condominium or a home. And finally, in terms of housing trends, one of the things that we look at in these kinds of reports are housing indicators. So this is reported on through Statistics Canada Census. And the 3 housing indicators that we look at are housing suitability. So a home is unsuitable if there's not enough bedrooms for the type and size of family. Adequacy, so a home is inadequate if major repairs are required. And affordability, so a home is considered unaffordable if the household is spending 30% or more of their gross income on shelter costs. And so, as you can see from the 2016 figures shown here, housing unaffordability is really the greatest challenge being faced by Sydney households based on the data that we have available. And to round out the statistical data that we looked at, we also did stakeholder interviews. So we did interviews with non-market housing and service providers, individuals working in market rental and ownership, seniors housing and support services, community and economic organizations, to kind of fill in the gaps and also understand what's happening on the ground today in 2019. I do want to preface this by saying, because a lot of housing and service providers do have a seniors focus, there is the potential that the findings in the report underrepresent other types of households. So what we heard at a very high level, the key needs and issues, is a need for housing for changing demographics. So some of the things that we heard was that increasingly seniors in the community are looking to downsize and need appropriate housing to do so, but also that younger households are either who are already living in Sydney and struggling to find housing that's suitable for them, or wanting to move to Sydney are struggling. We heard about a lack of workforce housing and employers struggling to attract workers. And in terms of that, what that really means is workforce housing that's affordable for folks that are working in the community. A lack of rental units at a range of affordability levels. And we also heard that the cost of land, which is common in many communities right now, is making affordable development cost prohibitive. We also asked interviewees to identify some opportunities for the town and also for others for ways to kind of address some of the housing gaps that they're seeing. So what we heard was a desire or interest in more housing options and more diversity in the type of housing, opportunities to offer development incentives, the need to engage and educate the community about housing so that people understand the housing need and priorities in the community. There's a need for investment in affordable housing from multiple stakeholders, and an interest in looking for ways to leverage municipal assets whenever possible for affordable housing. So to summarize, I'll present some of the key findings over the 3 overarching sections of the housing continuum: home ownership, rental, and supportive and transitional housing. And then I'll do an overview of some of our policy recommendations that we came away with. So when it comes to home ownership, we know that approximately 671 new ownership units have either been built since 2016 or are going to be coming online within the scope of this study. But so the number of new units is actually exceeding the pace of projected population growth, but the affordability of the new units is not addressing those kind of underlying and potentially growing issues in Sydney and also in the broader region. Rental emerged as the greatest need, and rental at a range of affordability levels. So Sydney has a number of new units coming online that are going to significantly boost the availability of purpose-built rentals. So the Aranza project that I believe is now occupied, so 56 new rental, including 28 near-market units and approximately 100 rental units in the next 2 to 3 years. So one of the things that we wanted to do was kind of quantify the rental housing need, and these are estimates, but they're intended to show the kind of scale of the underlying need. So based on households who are currently facing unaffordability and who would not be able to necessarily find something in the community right now because of the low vacancy rate. We estimated the number of households as of 2016 who weren't having their housing needs met. So that ended up at least 597 were either facing unaffordability, and that also includes the number, if nothing changed, the number of new units that would be needed to increase the vacancy rate. But that's a very conservative estimate because, of course, things are always in flux. And then we also estimated future demand for rental at each of those affordability levels. And we've assumed that things will stay relatively the same in terms of what affordability levels are needed, just because they have been consistent over the past few census periods. And I should mention in the report, we go into quite a lot of detail about what the definitions of below market, near market, and market. We've created figures that are very specific to Sydney. And I should also note that it's for every community that we're working with, partnerships and incentives and a combination of stakeholders working together are needed to provide rental units at different levels of affordability. This is not something that a municipality on its own can deliver. And then when it comes to supportive and transitional housing, 37 Sydney households are on BC's housing registry, which is their wait list. Plus there's an unknown number that are on other wait lists for co-ops or for seniors housing, etc. We also know that no units in Sydney are dedicated to serving persons with disabilities or individuals experiencing homelessness. Though on the last point, homelessness didn't emerge as a major issue in Sydney, but one that should be monitored in collaboration with the region. And so from that, we came away with 3 policy strategy directions. First, to strengthen policies and regulations to prioritize the needed housing types. 2, to strengthen incentives for nonprofit and private developers to build affordable units. And 3, to develop and strengthen partnerships and coordination. So I just want to emphasize that the key theme here is to strengthen. The town of Sydney has a number of things in place already, and with the new rental units coming on board, there's a really strong foundation there. So our strategies have focused on kind of honing in and expanding tools that are already existing within the municipality. So at a very high level, within each strategy, we have a number of potential action items in the report. But under strategy 1, the first one that we recommend is defining made in Sydney affordability levels in thresholds in the OCP. And the purpose of this is to kind of understand the new housing that's coming on board, whether it's addressing those needs that were identified in the housing study. Prioritizing affordable rental units through different tools such as the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund, density bonusing, and inclusionary zoning, including expanding the use of the latter 2 and expanding secondary suite opportunities because they are such a major part of Sydney's rental stock. And strategy number 2, around strengthening incentives. So introducing, testing, and promoting a package of incentives for multifamily developments with a sliding scale of incentives based on level of affordability. So building on work that the town has already been doing around supporting affordable housing developments. Building developer and nonprofit awareness of BC Housing and CMHC funding and financing programs, and also monitoring the impact of incentives to understand whether they're working in terms of achieving the desired units. And finally, strategy 3, developing and strengthening partnerships and coordination. So opportunities to do that include completing a land audit to identify underutilized lands in Sydney, and also using that as an engagement opportunity to see who is interested and willing to partner. Engaging BC Housing developers and nonprofit providers to identify opportunities for affordable housing and new developments, and convening conversations with local developers and BC Housing around the new BC Housing Affordable Home Ownership Program that just came online this year. So I just want to leave you with 4 key takeaways. The number of new units in Sydney is exceeding the pace of projected population growth. Though I will also caution that projections are estimates, right? And as you build more housing units, that also changes who wants to come live in your community. But greater affordability is needed to address those housing needs that I talked about. There's a significant need for rental housing at different affordability levels, but that incentives, grants, and land are required to support those affordability levels. As we heard in the interviews, the cost of land makes it very prohibitive for a developer on their own to provide those. And finally, partnerships are key to new affordable housing. And this is something that is just across the community, across BC. Most of the most innovative and affordable projects that are coming online are with partnerships through local government, developers, nonprofits, and BC Housing, and I should also say CMHC. So, yeah, thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Marina, for a very informative presentation. Appreciated. And I'll turn to my committee colleagues to see if anyone has questions for you with respect to the presentation. So we'll start with Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. So when it comes to the unsuitable housing, is there a criteria or a threshold where it comes to like the number of people per square foot or the number of bedrooms per people in the unit that triggers it becoming unsuitable? Just anecdotally, I've heard, even though it's a apparently very small number of our population who have, 3 or more children, obviously, that is what's happening, is that people with 3 or more children are moving into 2-bedroom units. And I'm wondering at what point that is considered unsuitable housing, even though it's affordable.
So that's a really good question. So I'll answer it with 2 ways. The suitability standard is based on the national occupancy standard that's defined by CMHC. And roughly speaking, it's based on no more than 2 people per bedroom. And adults and children do not share a bedroom, and children over 5 of the opposite sex do not share a bedroom. So that's a really rough one. I also want to add some context that I perhaps should have, is those numbers are as of 2016, and as we saw, a lot of the affordability issues came after 2015. So it's quite possible that those trends that you're seeing right now may not be captured in that small unsuitability figure for the most recent data that we have.
Thank you. I have Councillor Wainwright followed by Councillor Keith. Okay. Councillor Keith, I'm sure, has 2.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just curious about whether you've done any modeling in regards to the baby boomer effect. So, as the report outlines, a lot of the building that we've done in multifamily units for baby boomers across the country, pretty well it seems, that are retiring here. So I'm just wondering, knowing that the generations behind them there's not as many of them, and how that might impact on our markets, say, I don't know, as they expire.
That's a very good point. The scope of our study was over the next 5 years, so we didn't really do any modeling beyond then, but that is a trend that I know many communities are concerned about, where there's a massive need for housing for that demographic right now, but how do you start planning for after that demographic shift? So it wasn't part of our scope, but that's definitely
So I'm just wondering,
concern.
is that, whether that's being thought of in other communities? I'm just thinking, there's all of these multifamily dwellings now.
Yeah.
And as for the data you've provided, we seem to be building more than we need for our natural population growth. And so if we are to continue on that trend, are we looking like we're going to have an oversupply, I guess, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a longer term potential. I wouldn't be able to answer that question, but I think also within the short term, Sydney's operating also within the regional context where it's unclear whether it would be oversupply when there's so much demand in neighboring communities and in the region overall. But over the longer term, I think that's something that will need to be considered.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Thanks very much for your presentation. A couple of questions tied into affordability issues. It's probably not something you could, unless your stakeholders were willing to speak to it. We have quite a large international student population, And I'm supposing there are people that are able to afford their mortgages through that. That's probably not factored into your numbers for affordability, is it? I imagine.
For home ownership?
Yeah.
In terms of using secondary suites as mortgage helpers, or
Well, in terms of added income, I don't know if it'd even be considered a secondary suite. I think they just
or home
stay in a
stays,
bedroom,
or-
right?
yes.
Homestay type thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we did note that secondary suites, there's a lot of them in Sydney compared to purpose-built rental, but we didn't factor that into the mortgage gap analysis.
Right.
But that's definitely something that many households are probably considering if they're looking to buy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing I think about around affordability is if for whatever reason the interest rates start to rise, and you probably don't project that far into the future, but if we were to see a significant, even a slight increase in interest rates, I'm wondering how many of those homes will now become even more unaffordable for people that right now aren't in your percentages.
Yeah, that's
But
definitely.
there's no way to
a major
estimate that,
risk.
probably, is there?
No, we looked at, we estimated what incomes would be today based on 2016 figures,
Right.
and if someone were to try to buy a home, making the median income, just to show what that gap was. But there's, of course, so many other factors at play. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. Very concise and helpful, given the length of the substantial 100-page report. I'm wondering if you might be able to put up a slide that shows the continuum of housing.
Yes, I have one at the beginning. 1 second. This one?
Great, thank you. So just a little help on two of these. You've certainly explained near market rental, below market rental, deep affordability being income assistance and shelter rate. But I'm not sure, and I certainly, we appreciate market rental, attainable home ownership, but secondary rental, can you flesh that out a little bit?
In terms of affordability levels?
Well,
or?
yeah, and what it really means.
Yeah,
It's
so
kind of
secondary rental within the context of the recommendations has focused on secondary suites in homes and then carriage houses. But it can also mean people renting condos or their whole home. That's all included in the secondary market.
Okay,
Is
so
there a particular part of that?
okay, so I understand the part in terms of secondary suites and coach homes, but you're saying if a person rents, if a person is renting, when is it considered they're renting in the secondary market? Apart from coach homes and
so if
secondary
they're
suites.
within the secondary market, if they're renting a condominium, so someone bought a condominium, but they don't want to live in it, they want to rent it, I would say because they are using it for investment or they're not living in the community for a period of time,
Okay.
that's also considered secondary market.
Okay, so with that example, how does that set a different market rate in this continuum between why isn't it just considered market rental?
Because that's a very good point, and in the report I refer to secondary rental can come at all different levels of affordability. It's also hard for an external force to dictate the affordability of a secondary rental unit unless some kind of incentive is offered. It's not the same as purpose-built rental, which that's what market rental is really referring to, is rental units that are built exclusively for the use as rental units, whereas secondary units, they might be rental for 5 or 10 years, but then they could revert back to the owner. So in terms of how it's perceived, purpose-built rental, which here is shown as market rental, is generally considered more stable and secure in terms of protected rental housing, where secondary rental is very important, as you can see from the numbers, but it's not as stable because if the homeowner wants to move back home or wants to use a secondary suite for their child, that unit can be lost from the rental market.
Okay, so the rates aren't necessarily going to be different between the two, but you
Not
mentioned in your
necessarily.
presentation about CMHC not keeping statistics for secondary rental.
They don't keep good statistics. They don't provide them for Sydney specifically, and what they do provide is for Victoria region, and there's a lot of data gaps, so that's why I didn't include it here.
Okay, and the other is supportive housing for seniors. How would you define that?
So it can, that's kind of a catch-all, and it's shown here at the left of the housing continuum because it's generally considered to be more supportive housing, whether it's assisted living or residential care. But then there's also units that might be independent living or just seniors, market ownership or market rental targeted towards seniors. But I wouldn't consider that part of supportive housing for seniors. So seniors housing kind of can cover multiple parts of the continuum.
Okay, so you haven't spoken to the demand or the offering of supportive housing needs such as assisted or independent or, I mean, we had a
No.
presentation earlier this evening,
Yeah.
you know, with a continuum of senior care
Mm-hmm.
from independent living to assisted living to memory care.
Yeah.
That's captured there, but it's not really defined in your report in terms of whether there's good availability or not, or whether the market rates are suitable or not.
No, we didn't go into depth with that in the report. What we saw was that a lot of the housing units that were coming online were marketed towards seniors, but when we looked at affordability levels, we didn't break that down into age groups because that kind of fine grain of detail wasn't available in the data.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, affordable seniors housing, particularly those on fixed incomes or single, is an
Yeah.
issue.
Absolutely.
I mean,
So
BCY's, Sydney.
yes. So in terms of that deep affordability rental, below market rental, near market, we're not excluding, seniors aren't excluded from that.
Mhm.
They're just not broken out. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
You spoke to one of your sources of information at the outset being AirDNA,
Mm-hmm.
if I captured that. In your report, you really haven't spoken a lot to short-term vacation rentals and the impact on the housing market. Is that something you haven't delved into yet in working with communities, or?
At the level of a housing needs assessment, we don't normally go into it in a huge amount of detail unless it's specifically requested. So we just provided that information for context. But I think it's clear that perhaps a little bit more work is needed to better understand the implications in Sydney. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the cost of renting is rising faster than incomes from the 2008 to 2018 period.
Mhm.
There was the figure of 43%. Is that a CRD figure or is that a Sydney figure, 43%?
That 43% is Victoria Census Metropolitan Area, which includes Sydney. I also showed median rents for Sydney, which were not as steep, but I think it was 30% for 2 bedrooms and a little bit less for 1 bedrooms. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned monitoring the impact if you're to implement policy or programs
Mm-hmm.
for affordability that recommended to monitor those incentive programs annually to see their effectiveness on new units coming. Are you aware from your consulting that you do of other communities that have implemented policies and have measured them and seen success in particular ways?
In terms of measurement, I think that is something that we often see lacking in terms of monitoring, which is one of the reasons we included it as a policy recommendation. Our best practices were based on practices that we pulled from communities where they've implemented, it's been around for a few years and they have seen traction, but data on how well they've worked is scarce. It's very scarce.
Okay, I have a couple of others, but I'll let pass the mic on. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fallon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your report and for your presentation this evening. Further to what the Mayor just touched on, you'd mentioned that the rents have gone up 43%, but there's also the tenancy branch that controls or dictates the amount that rents. Where does that come from? Where does that 40% or 43% increase come from then?
So that 43% is for the Victoria CMA, the Census Metropolitan Area, which is the region around Victoria, including Sydney. Sydney's has been a little bit less than 43, so I just want to clarify that. It comes from a few things. So landlords with long-term residents may be increasing. They have a maximum that they're allowed to increase their rents each year. So part of it is that. Some landlords choose not to increase it every year as well, for lots of different reasons. And then the bigger issues that we're seeing in a lot of communities is actually turnover of tenants. So when a tenant leaves their unit, their landlord is no longer required to stay within.
Oh, so we can establish new base.
Exactly. So when someone leaves their unit, if they've been there for 10 years, they're usually paying well below market rents. And so if a new tenant comes in, that landlord gets to reset. But once the
Okay.
tenant is in, now they're beholden to that annual increase
Okay.
from the RTB. Yeah.
Thank you for that explanation.
Yeah,
Appreciate
of
it.
course.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe.
Just one more question, and this might be outside of the scope of this, but I'll ask anyways.
Sure.
Just because I think it's important for us to have, in order for us to have strategies to move forward with dealing with affordability and some of these things, you know, some sense of how we got here in the first place in terms of the affordability issue. And there's obviously been that decoupling or that loss of a relationship between median income and the average house that people can afford. And so the province has put in things to deal with money laundering that has had an impact on the housing market, on speculation. Municipalities now have the ability to monitor short-term rentals. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments based on research that you've done or what you've seen in other municipalities in terms of whether some of these measures that the provincial government is putting in place in regards to speculation and short-term rentals, money laundering, whether we're anticipating or seeing much of an impact on that in regards to more stuff coming available and thus greater affordability perhaps in the future.
That's a great question. I think that a very good point is that the provincial government and the federal, but especially the provincial government, have implemented a number of measures very, very recently to address housing. The housing needs reports are one of them, but not the only one. Some of the measures I don't think have been in place for long enough for us to see the traction. But what I have seen in my work is in really overheated markets. So I'll give you the example of the North Shore of Vancouver, Metro Vancouver. Once some of those vacancy tax was introduced, the foreign buyers tax was introduced, there was a market shift in the average sales price of homes in a very short period of time. But it's only been about a year for which we have that data. So it's not clear if that trend will persist or if it'll reverse. So it's still kind of, I think everyone's monitoring the situation. So in terms of those kind of measures to either cool the market or kind of address those policy gaps like around short-term rentals, I think that what we're seeing is local governments are putting in measures, the province has put in measures, and it has made some shifts. It's just still to be seen whether those will persist. And the other important thing is also that the province has made a lot of funding available for affordable housing, more than has been in recent years. And then CMHC has also created additional financing opportunities. So what we are also seeing in a lot of communities is like the partnerships that I've spoken about, partnerships jumping on those opportunities to build affordable housing at different affordability levels. So I think in the coming years, a lot is going to be happening around affordable housing. Yeah.
Thank you. Just looking at Councillor Duncan, and I believe you had some follow-up questions. No? Okay. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I guess it's kind of a follow-up to Councillor O'Keefe's earlier point about kind of the transitional nature of our housing stock and to your data that we have this massive supply of single-family houses and only maybe one or two people living in it. And of course, those people probably are going to need help with their yard work and with paying their mortgages and stuff too. And it feels like we have what, 700 new rental units that we need to be able to build in the next couple of years, 600 of them immediately. We've been building like 100 units a year. We obviously can't do that, but it seems like we've got this stock of housing that we could retrofit, and there's probably quite a substantial number of those people who would love to be able to age in place in their home and put in a suite. But I hear, again, anecdotally, people saying it's just cost prohibitive for them to put in a legal suite. Have you seen any municipality elsewhere where they've managed to come up with an incentive package or something at the federal or provincial level? Like, I mean, I'd heard of municipalities giving kind of like one-time grants, but, you know, like $5,000 up to a maximum of, you know, a $10,000, which is, you know, if it's $60,000 to do a suite is not helpful. But so I don't know if the federal government has started looking at that. The provincial government, it seems like it would be cheaper.
I wouldn't be able to speak about what's happening at the moment with the BC Building Code, but I know that is across communities, like the barrier that they're facing. People want to put in legal secondary suites and they just can't afford to, and it's just, or their house, a lot of homes are older and they actually can't. Maybe the ceiling height is just not high enough, or there's not an opportunity to put in the things that are needed. So I get that. There's a provincial, you know, the provincial regulation doesn't really allow the local government to a lot of flexibility around that area, around that. There's other opportunities in terms of being more flexible in the types of secondary suites that are available. So, for example, allowing carriage homes in more locations, allowing borders, which I believe are already happening, like the homestays that have been mentioned. The district of Kitimat is the main example that we have for a community incentivizing secondary suites, because in that community, secondary suites, again, are such a big part of their rental housing stock. So that's the main example that I can point to. But I will say with secondary suites, we did focus on opportunities to expand or incentivize secondary suites, but there are some just real limitations in terms of a homeowner being able to install a secondary suite legally.
Thank you. So I'll do a final call for any questions from Marina. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
I'd like to move the recommendation, one, that council receive the Town of Sydney 2019 Housing Needs Report dated October 29th, 2019, prepared by Urban Matters CCC. Thank you. And two, that the Housing Needs Report be posted on the Town of Sydney's website as per provincial requirements.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion from the committee? Thank you very much, Marina, for your presentation and for answering so many questions. And you did a great job and very informative. Appreciate it. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you. I just wanted to summarize perhaps how this report came to be. Council, in its strategic plan, upon taking office at the beginning of the term, committed to a comprehensive review of our official community plan, and the province in 2018 brought in new, under the Local Government Act, brought in new regulations such that local governments in British Columbia need to do a housing needs assessment either within every 5 years or before they start an OCP. So that's what prompted us early this year to go to an RFP and have this important report done. It makes many recommendations, but basically this kicks off the start of our OCP review. Staff will be working with this and the recommendations, and the next stage, if you will, in our comprehensive OCP review process is to have an approach report from staff, which I understand is coming later on this fall. And so we thank, again, Urban Matters for the detail in this report, and we look forward to working with staff on moving recommendations forward.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion's carried. So we'll now return to item 4A on the agenda, which is the use of amenity contributions. And there's a report from staff. I'll turn to committee for discussion and recommendation.
I'll move the recommendation that the committee discuss potential policies for the use of community amenity funds and make recommendations to council for amendments or additions to the current policy.
Point of order, if I might, Chair. that's a staff recommendation, but that I think is giving us direction to have a fulsome discussion and perhaps make more specific recommendations.
So perhaps we'll yield the motion at this time, and we'll look to have a discussion around the report and can add then some recommendations to be included with the motion. So I'll open the floor for discussion, Committee of the Whole. Councillor Wainwright.
I guess I'll start things off. I like or I'm in favor that the majority of the amenity funds should be used on capital projects as opposed to otherwise, but I do see the need for some flexibility about that because in particular, if we're looking at doing something about affordable housing, I don't see us investing in capital projects as being necessarily the most effective or practical way of going about it. But with respect to the other kinds of potential amenities, it does seem to me that that might be better off directed towards capital projects. There's also a suggestion that amenities are, well, they're collected from a particular development in a particular area or neighborhood with, I think, an expectation that that there is a desire to provide amenities in that general area, in effect to compensate for the bonus density that is the source of the amenities. That does make sense. I do appreciate that there are some amenities that essentially apply to the community as a whole. So for example, a new library or something like that. I don't think there is a requirement for that to be in the particular neighborhood, but if we're talking about things like sidewalks, streetlights, things like that, I do think those should be directed to the area around the development that contributed the funds, because it's the neighborhood that is most impacted by the increase in density, typically. There's a suggestion that our policy should lean towards things that provide benefit to the greatest number, and I can see that as being part of the criteria of figuring out where the amenity funds would go. You know, if we have two options and they're otherwise similar, but one provides benefits to more people, I would certainly be leaning in that direction. Then I guess there's a bit of a question about, do we divvy the amenities that are the contribution, the cash that's collected, do we divvy it up into multiple pots, or do we just put it all in one amenity fund, and that would give us a great deal of flexibility? I do recall obviously was on council, so was Councillor Fallett, when the policy was put in place that put 2/3 into affordable housing and 1/3 into general. And that struck me as very much an ad hoc sort of decision. There wasn't any consultation with the community about that split, about whether it was appropriate or otherwise. And at the time, those in favor of the particular split argued that we should try it out for a few years and we could revisit it later. So we have been trying it out for a few years, and I think we should actually think about it. I'm not arguing necessarily that the split is wrong, but we haven't actually spent any of the funds that are in the affordable housing amenity fund, and we haven't even had anything come forward where we've even thought about using those funds. There's approximately $500,000 in there now, and with developments that are expected soon, staff are estimating a potential balance might be 1.4 million in the foreseeable future, which is a lot. And that is too much not to be using it, because the whole purpose of collecting the funds is to provide a benefit to the community. So that one is a bit problematic. I'm not suggesting that council should be making any decisions necessarily tonight. I'm just starting the discussion. One of the things that isn't in the staff report, but I remember noticing when I was looking at how other municipalities deal with amenity funds, is that quite a lot of them actually had some significant consultation with the community about policy of what they do with their amenity funds. And some of them are incredibly granular about it. Like Vancouver's got a particular corridor where if a development's in that corridor, the amenity funds go in this particular direction, and they actually have it laid out in terms of different neighborhoods with different objectives of how the amenity funds get spent. Sometimes they list, some communities will list specific projects, and staff's mentioned that. So for example, I remember, and I think it was Vancouver, one of the neighborhoods, they actually have a project of a public library, but they would not consider that in some of the other neighborhoods of Vancouver. And, you know, we do have some things that we've identified as needs, things like daycares and playground amenities and things like that. So I could see that we could potentially come up with a list, and developers often find it more compatible with their interests to actually do something, you know, build a sidewalk or whatever, as opposed to just hand over some cash. It tends to be more, it's something that they can do in kind easier than make a cash contribution. I would not want to try coming up with a list of projects off the top of my head, and that's definitely something that I would be looking for some input from staff and also from the community. So I guess one of the things I would say out of this is I think it's good for us to have the conversation, but actually I would benefit from getting some feedback from the community before we try to lock in on anything. Those are my starting comments.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. Turning to Councillor O'Keefe and then Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll preface my comments on the considerations here by saying I agree with Councillor Wainwright that getting some feedback from the community is important. It sounds like this is a fund that's been set up for a few years now. We haven't spent as much as we could from it, and I think it would be good to have some sort of engagement process. So I'd be interested to hear from staff in terms, at some point in the, not tonight, but how onerous or a process that might be, or maybe we can do it through an online survey. Anyways, I think I agree that it's an important thing. Just some of initial comments from me. In regards to the 2/3, 1/3 split, and whether we should maintain an amount for affordable housing, I'm still in favor of that. I know that we could just throw things into one pot and then use for whatever we wanted out of there for affordable housing, but I think it's important to maintain that as a priority and a commitment to affordable housing. So I'd like to see us continue doing something on that. In regards to that, we haven't spent much from that. I think now we have an opportunity with the housing needs of assessment. We've got a better idea of where some of the areas are for improvement. And I think I've heard some creative ideas, you know, even tonight about how we might be able to tap into that and use that. In regards to the, you know, capital projects versus other things, I would agree with that as well, except for the affordable housing fund. In terms of whether the funds should be used in the immediate area, I'm not sure about that. And I guess what I'm thinking is that, as the report mentions, our community is so small anyways, and I think those of us who might not live in the downtown core, we're still impacted somewhat because we come here and we do our shopping and our services here. And if most of the bonus density is going to come from the downtown core, again, that means that downtown gets everything. And I guess I'd like to see us spread the wealth a little bit more around the community and that sort of thing. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councillor Keith. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. The approach I took with this helpful report is looking back to how amenities have been funded in the community over the last 10 years or so. And the bonus density has changed the way it works in our community and has raised funds or led to the community having amenities. And what I found myself thinking is, well, one thing is we went through our budget process earlier this year and we found particular projects that we thought were important for the community, and what we were looking to do is find a way to fund them. And so we were saying, will this come out of the gas tax, or will this come out of the land reserve sale, or will this come out of the amenity fund, and so on. And so, having said that, I was thinking on this continuum that on the one hand, I think of infrastructure at one end of the spectrum and amenity in some sense at the other end. And when we have to fund infrastructure, so we had to build a new fire hall, that's a new piece of infrastructure. Where are you going to use your community amenity fund for that sort of infrastructure, or for new roadway, or for new gutters or sewers and that sort of thing? And I would say for that type of infrastructure, no, that would be funded elsewhere through borrowing, reserves, what have you. But on the other side, when you look at some of the amenities that have come to the community, when I think of the street furniture, some of the public art, we've actually had walkways and that sort of thing. When I look at things we've considered this year, such as the Parks Master Plan, and in the Parks Master Plan, there's $1.5 million of improvements in 3 particular parks, and you could consider some of those things as amenities for the community. Now, they might be considered more amenities just for the local neighborhood that park is in, but in some cases you could think of, parks and recreation. You know, if we were to put pickleball courts in a particular park and it was used by residents throughout the community, is that infrastructure or is it amenity? We think of climate action, multimodal transportation, secure and weather-protected bicycle storage, community gardens. I mean, there's a huge range of things that you would typically call amenities, and the community at large can benefit, or a significant portion of the community has an opportunity to benefit from them. So when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about what's currently in the policy in terms of tangible amenities are to benefit the community in the area of the proposed development. And previous councillors committee members have spoken to that. And I side with Councillor Wainwright in an example. For example, if we have used amenity funds for funding underground wiring. We're doing it with 3 of the projects on 3rd Street. And so I would say in that case, yes, if you were going to agree to fund underground wiring with amenity funds, do it on the property that's adjacent to it. But if you're doing downtown street furniture, are you only going to put the street furniture in front of the new development? that sort of thing. So I think there would be very limited cases. I would be happy removing it as a requirement to have it in the local area of the development, but certainly being aware when it came time to consider whether or not a committee or council of the day would say it was relevant to put it associated with that development. So where I'm going here is I would prefer to see in the staff report, given that it talked about the land sale reserve, the general capital reserve, the gas tax, this fund, the community fund is currently broken into two. It's broken into a housing and a general. Quite frankly, I would prefer to see one pool. And I would prefer to see it as one pool, but then us come up with policy that indicated what types of categories of project or types of project would qualify for amenities and what would be infrastructure. So for example, a sidewalk infill, is that really benefiting the community at large? We have a reserve fund for sidewalk replacement, even though it's an environmental initiative and we might consider that an amenity from that perspective. You know, should we be funding it? So I prefer to see the policy around what is really infrastructure and how that should be funded and what is amenities, and seeing what the combination of fund, because quite frankly, we have a land reserve fund, or a land sale reserve fund. So if we sell a piece of land, we have those monies. It's usually significant, but quite frankly, I think under the Local Government Act, it indicates that the first priority should be to go ahead and purchase another piece of land. Well, the town is not likely to do that in our currently built-out communities. So, and we are permitted in the Local Government Act to actually take that money and use it on other things. So I would like staff to consider that, and again, not make decisions tonight, but consider that spectrum. And then once we come up with those categories, I think it would be very worthwhile to go to the public for input and engagement in terms of, well, what sort of amenities? Is it public washrooms? Well, we've already heard about public washrooms, but what sort of amenities are on the priority list for council? As an example, I think it's the city of Victoria, please don't quote me, but it is one of the larger municipalities that actually takes its budget surplus and goes ahead and puts it out to public engagement in terms of what their preferences or priorities are for, in effect, what becomes usually community amenities, sometimes might be considered infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Councillor Duncan, followed by Councillor Fallon and Councillor Gurnett. Councillor Duncan.
Thank you to the chair. Thank you. Just taking notes of it as everybody else was talking. I concur with everything the mayor just said about the infrastructure and amenities and kind of where things make sense to be close to it and where things make sense. And as Councillor O'Keefe was saying, that being able to spread the wealth. And one criteria I could think of off the bat for that would be, we do have pockets of areas where we've had increasing density outside the core. So down towards West Haven, McDonald Park Road, well, that might be more North Saanich. And then we hear neighborhoods talking about where increasing traffic. That's always a concern where we start putting in increased density is there's increasing traffic. And we know that there's certain routes in town just because of the way the roads are that are going to get hit with that traffic. So I feel that could be an opportunity for us to be able to say, like, outside of these developments, there are neighborhoods that are going to be impacted by those developments downstream that we can do things about. Sidewalk. There's not much we can do with throws, but if something comes up, we realize we could actually do something about it. That might qualify. Councillor Wainwright mentioned daycare, and that again would be something that wouldn't necessarily have to be in that neighborhood, but would be in the community as a whole as we increase family housing if we get a chance to do that. And I actually didn't find an example of somebody having used it, but I know the BC Chamber of Commerce mentions that it is a use of community amenity funds. Stormwater management and soft landscaping, that could be something being able to look at outside the neighborhood as well. Perhaps that's downstream. I would hopefully that would be also an opportunity for developers if we can identify that ahead of time to put in that as an in-kind. And I guess to speak to Councillor Wainwright's note about being able to put it out to the community, I don't know, putting it out to the community ahead of time, I wonder if that can be kind of bundled in the OCP process about getting an idea of, we have money and we have this official community plan, kind of looking at like, what is it people are thinking might be missing and could be used, and just kind of an awareness of that's there and what might qualify. But thinking about Victoria's surplus, and that they put it out as kind of, sounds like a participatory budgeting exercise. And I wonder if that might actually be something that we could start looking at when we have, you know, a defined amount of money. And if we have projects that are coming up and the council of the day is not certain, you know, some of these, you know, we can fund this with gas tax, we can fund this way and this way, and that there's some that are coming up and the council is deciding, should we use our amenity fund that way? Well, maybe that's actually the time to take that chunk out to the community and be able to say, here are some options, here's how much, and help them and let people kind of go through that. You know, you spend this much on this project, you can't spend it on this project. And I don't know, it might be like a buzzwordy topic right now. It's participatory budgeting. And I guess another example of the use of affordable housing funds that was a little different was, I heard recently about Oxford, Ontario, which I think has a population maybe 10 times ours. So they've probably collected more funds, but they were actually using it to top up on affordable housing, to actually make all of their new affordable housing that was built up to passive house standards, which significantly lowers the utility cost for the renters that are in there, which can make a big difference. And so, you know, in Ontario, for example, if their energy costs were $100 a month, it dropped it to $4.50 a month, $4.50 a month. And that was the difference between the people who are living there being able to, or having to take the food bank and not. So just as a top up, it was, you know, he said the difference between the cost to build, you know, a step 3 development equivalent, and passive house, they got it down to about a 5%. And so that's what the town put forward to say, like, okay, it costs you nothing more, developer, to build it to passive house standards. We'll front that. And it ended up saving the renters a substantial amount of money. There's a learning curve. It wasn't that cheap to begin with, but that's what it costs now. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, unique use of that funding.
Thank you. I have Councillor Fallon next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the words that I came across as I was looking at different municipalities and how they look at their amenity funds is they identified it as making their community or their city more livable. And I think that's an important thing. It takes it away a little bit from an amenity as like a nice to have, and makes it more livable. So when I think about Sydney and our size and our population, we probably could qualify as a neighborhood in a large city. And so I'd be a bit more lenient with using the amenity funds in the area that it derived from. I would say all of Sydney qualifies as the area that could benefit from it. And certainly listening to an earlier presentation with the housing needs assessment, I think affordability and how we go about that really needs to be addressed. I don't think that's negotiable. I happen to, in my own personal budgeting, I always like to segregate things. So I like the idea of actually setting a percentage or something aside and saying this goes towards housing. I think it's a tidier way to do it. So for me, those are the two things that I think the monies should be used throughout the community, and I think we should have a affordable housing portion of our amenity funds. And what qualifies as an amenity, if infrastructure as opposed to the added on extras, if it turns out that it makes our community more livable, whether it is a sidewalk, and we'd had that discussion earlier during the budget time when we were looking at the sidewalk down on First Street. And I didn't want to do a knee-jerk reaction to take the money out of the funding at that time and say we need to have a more fulsome conversation And I think that still stands. Having said that now, I also look at saying that if adding a sidewalk is something our municipality should be doing as part of its budgeting plans, we also see that our community is growing in ways that perhaps we don't necessarily think of at the time when we're making our projections and seeing there's a greater use in this area or something about this area has changed, and a sidewalk is needed here. And I think maybe that's the time we say, you know what, we're going to take it out of that pool and we're going to add a sidewalk here. So I think there's some flexibility. I also really like the idea of going out to the community and having some input, because obviously there's a lot of difference of opinions and perspectives, and I don't think we necessarily need to just leave it with ourselves to say we'll make that decision and choice. I think it is good to hear, what does the public think about this? This is, heaven forbid, we should have extra money that we don't know how to spend. But I think a developer is getting a benefit by the rezoning, increasing the density, and this then comes as an amenity towards the community to give something back to the community. So I think this is something that we can look at and say, what are we going to do for our community? Thank you.
Thank you. I have Councillor Garnett and then Councillor Wainwright. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We just had a really nice report done for us by Urban Matters on our housing needs assessment. So I'll sort of speak to that with regards to the fund. And I believe, much like Councillor Fallot, that it should be separate. I don't think we should lump it in together, because I fear that, or I'd be reticent to do that, because I fear that if we decide there's lots of things done in the community, the fund becomes too low. I like to see it really high. I don't care if we haven't used it yet. There's going to be a time when we're going to need it. And I like to be as high as it can be, so that if we can work with other organizations and really help nail that near market, below market rental, which is such a dire need in our community. And I fear that if we lump it into one fund, we might find ourselves using too much of it for other amenities, which are worthwhile, but are, in my opinion, not as important as what we've seen tonight is pretty critical for our community. So I'd be more in line with keeping it as it is. I'd actually even be willing to go as far as saying it can be an 80-20 split, because I think it's that important. I just think we need the money there. And if organizations reach out for us and we need to match it and it's not there, we could leave ourselves with a bit of a problem. So that's all I want to speak to with regards to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. So prior to going to speakers for a second time, I just looked to staff here. I'm getting the impression that we may not come up with enough specificity this evening around making recommendations, but that you're likely gleaning some good ideas or consensus here. From your perspective with regards to timeline and decisions that need to be made from council, are you comfortable with seeing this as a report received for information and gleaning from the minutes some general direction?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Staff are entirely comfortable with initiating this discussion tonight and finishing it at a later time, perhaps after you've received the additional reports on the other funding sources that might be related to complete the picture. But also, if no policy is set before the next budget, we're quite happy to bring forward capital items that we think might qualify, and then you can accept or reject them. However, we would like to have some council or committee comment about the proposed use of the affordable housing portion that's in the report.
Thank you, staff, and so hopefully that gives council some further direction as we continue this rather fulsome discussion. I think it's important. I will just note that one of the policy considerations noted in here, number 7, was around introducing a waiver of CACs for certain eligible projects such as affordable housing, purpose-built rentals. I'm quite comfortable with seeing that included in further discussions for staff's information, and I'll leave that as a comment for my for my committee colleagues as well. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess a couple of things. First, I'm just going to start off, and this is kind of the benefit of the audience. Between 2011 and now, just over, a little under $500,000 has been allocated to a variety of amenity projects, and actually more than half of it on sidewalks and walkways. Roughly 50,000, so about 10% on public art, something like 15 or so % on streetscape improvements like Beacon Avenue furniture, and a small amount on park improvements and other things. So our past practice has actually been leaning heavily towards the sidewalks and walkways. I concur with a lot of comments from my colleagues. I think that there are a variety of infrastructure projects that nobody would reasonably consider amenities. So you're looking at putting in a new storm drain, forget it. That's not an amenity. Neither is a new sewer pipe or a water main. You know, that stuff people just expect us to do. And sidewalks are kind of in that category too. And we may have funded some sidewalk projects with amenity funds in the past, but the question I'd sort of throw out there is a lower tax rate considered an amenity? Because we probably would have done it anyway, except we would have just taken it from taxes. Now, clearly, at the far end of the spectrum, when you get into things like public art, it is, you know, a bona fide amenity. We wouldn't probably be looking at doing it from tax funding in a lot of cases. But I think if you ask a member of the community and you give them some examples, you know, starting with we're putting in a new water main, over to the other end of the spectrum, we're going to put another sculpture in the sculpture walk. People are going to be able to tell you kind of where their line ends. And widening a sidewalk might be an amenity, but putting in a sidewalk maybe they will think isn't. Personally, I kind of lean in that direction. Like, a lot of West Sydney is wanting sidewalks, and honestly, I don't think they'd be happy if you told them, you know, it's going to be funded eventually from the amenity funds. They've been paying taxes a long time. They expect some of their taxes to go into infrastructure in their neighborhoods. So this one's going to take a bit of wrestling, and I realize that's a bit difficult. So we've spent, like I say, roughly, well, close to $500,000. The current balance is a little bit less than $750,000. So we've actually got quite a bit. We haven't, and of course most of it in the affordable housing, but not all of it. I wonder if one of the policy things we shouldn't be thinking about is planning to spend a certain amount of amenity funding annually. Like, I'm not saying a particular amount, but I think if we're collecting the money, there's an expectation that we're not simply hoarding it. And I don't know what that magic number is, but I'd throw that out as something we should maybe be talking about, because as far as approving amenity projects and getting public input, well, we do it through the budget process. It's quite open. People do have the opportunity, but if there was an expectation that we're going to spend between $50,000 and $100,000 out of the amenity fund every year, that would be a bit of a different story. There'd be a group of projects maybe coming forward that were potentially coming out of that list, and people would definitely tell us what they think, and they'd probably ask us why this project's not on the list, and so on. I don't know if that would be a really helpful approach, but I'm just throwing out some ideas that we maybe should be thinking about. With respect to how critical it is to be collecting a lot of money for the Affordable Housing Fund, the Aranza project, the town provided financial incentives that I think totaled somewhere around 400,000 in value. Tax exemptions, waivers of permit fees, things like that. And absolutely nothing out of an affordable housing fund. Like, we did not contribute any cash. So we actually have the policy tools to be able to provide a lot in the way of incentives. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider topping it up or doing some other things as well, but we don't need to be, building a war chest to be able to do this. If we want to provide incentives to make things happen, we don't necessarily need cash. And that number 7 on the list, waiving the amenity fees for eligible projects, is one of the more obvious ones. And anyway, again, I'm not proposing any particular recommendations. I'm just wanting us to kind of explore the topic.
Thank you. I have Mayor McNeil-Smith next.
Thank you again, Chair. Something Councillor Committee Member Fallett spoke of triggered something. If we provided, say, $20,000 to a particular purpose-built rental project that brought more affordability or brought affordability to it, and so you had affordable units in that project, are affordable units an amenity in our community? I wouldn't necessarily think of that as amenity. I'm not arguing against a housing fund or a housing amenity fund. What I'm going with is what Councillor Fallett's used the term livable versus amenity, and I would actually propose we change our amenity fund to our livable community fund. And now you could say infrastructure helps make a livable community, but going back to what I started off earlier, I would like to draw a distinction between pure infrastructure, if there is such a thing, and amenities, or what I'm going to say are these things that you do to make a more livable community. And when I think of the past practice, when I served on council back in 2008, 2011, we went through the budget process. We often had to remove things from the budget. And then later in the year, I think it was May or June, it came back to us what the surplus was for the previous calendar year. That was often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we considered projects to fund from that surplus fund. We've moved away from that as a community, and I support what we have in place now, not going through that process. I think it's better to go ahead and put the money in the surplus account, which is what we do now. And when we come back to the next budgeting process, you're determining your priorities. You're looking at the entire $20 million budget. You're looking at your infrastructure. You're looking at your operating costs, your staffing, and you look at your community amenities, and you set your priorities. So, by earlier suggesting that a particular municipality goes ahead and takes its surplus and puts it out to a participatory, I'm not supportive of that. I agree with what the town is currently doing now. Elaborating a little further on Councillor Wainwright's point with regards to the housing fund, it sounds nice if you say we're putting 70%, we're putting 80%, we're putting the majority of the bonus density from that project into the housing fund. Well, it doesn't say how much you're putting in. It doesn't speak to what you actually need to have in a housing amenity fund to support a project. I think what you do is you take a look at your resources, as I say, whether you can take money from the land sale reserve or use other tools that Councillor Wainwright mentioned, and you're determining your priorities. And if we think we need $100,000, I don't think we should be restricted that there would only be $80,000 in the community housing amenity fund. I think we would want to look to the larger pool to say, okay, this is important, this is a priority, and it can come out of the amenity fund. I might even suggest, with, again, furthering Councillor Wainwright's point, to perhaps we should consider on an annual basis allocating amenity funds, since we are accumulating, is that we may come up with to say that, in general, from year to year, our community amenity fund should be at this level, and perhaps you take a certain portion of your surplus, if it's available, given that staff have a recommendation of what our surplus should be at, that we move money from surplus to that pool of livable community funds.
Thank you very much. I have Councillor Garnett next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Point valid, Councillor Wainwright, Committee Member Wainwright. I guess the only concern I have with that, with regards to what you said about the Aranza building, is that I think it's important to remember that that created 28 near market rental spaces, and we need, by possible future calculations, 600. So I think we do have things in place that help us along the way, but I certainly would be feeling more comfortable if we had resources as well, if that was required at some point in the future. So that's why I'm hesitant to make that change. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll turn to staff. Mr. Hissick.
One question we have is, would it be useful for council to come back with a recommended policy for you guys to hash out, as opposed to a bunch of general topics for discussion? I'm not sure we've heard enough definitive direction to do that, but it could be another stab at this to do that.
My thought would be that probably provides us another opportunity, and with a little more focus in the report for council or for committee of the whole's consideration, and so that would certainly meet with my approval. Having said that, we would still look for a motion to receive the information and refer it back to staff for refinement. We've gone around almost twice completely. I'll go to Councillor O'Keefe, and then we'll look to see if we can have a motion.
Thank you. Just if staff are looking for more direction or ideas, if they're thinking to come back to us with some other things, and sounds like they're looking for, what are we going to use the Housing Affordable Fund? They've given an example. I mean, one thing that I would love us to do, and Committee Member Duncan has mentioned as well, the ability to use some of that fund to encourage more affordable housing units through incentivizing for secondary suites. So whether it's grants of $10,000, maybe we allocate a certain number per year out of the Affordable Housing Fund, that if you build a secondary suite, you get whatever, $10,000 or towards the cost of that. I'm just plucking that number out of the air, but and maybe there's other things that we do as well, like give a break on the permit fees, inspection fees, whatever else is there as well. So that's one way that I would like us to see, to use the Affordable Housing Fund. I think it's something that we would get a quicker return on than, in the Housing Needs Assessment Report, we saw that there's a lot of projects that are on the go, but it'll be a couple of years by the time these things get up and running, and most of those are targeted for high end anyways. So it just seems to me such a good idea to be able to do that, to allow older people and empty nesters that have that excess space to be able to age in place and either move into their basement suite and rent the upstairs up to a young family that needs that space. Also good for the economy in terms of the construction industry as well. So just, if you're looking for ideas, there you go.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, and I'll turn to Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I'd move receipt of the report for information.
Second.
Further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion carries. And with that, we'll look from that expectation to hear back from staff at a future opportunity with some of the general consensus that we heard in the discussion this evening. Thank you to Committee of the Whole for that discussion. We have no other business under Agenda Item 8. There's no new business under Agenda Item 9. We are not going in camera this evening, and so that leaves us with a motion to adjourn, please.
So move.
Thank you. Thank you. All in favor? Motion carries. We're adjourned. Thank you.